Let's be honest. You probably think you know everything there is to know about Sparta, don't you? After all, the Spartans were just brutal warriors, right? But before you click away, ask yourself, are you sure? The truth might just shatter everything you've been told. Stick around and see if you still believe in the Spartan myth after you hear what really went down. Hit that subscribe button, share your thoughts below, and join us as we unravel the truth about Sparta. You've probably heard the name Sparta thrown around 1,000 times, especially when it comes to its warrior culture. But let's be real for a moment. What if everything you think you know about Sparta is just a half-truth? And what if I told you that even the warriors we imagine when we think about Spartan warriors didn't quite exist as we know them? Sounds like a twist, doesn't it? But here's the kicker. Most of our historical understanding of Sparta has been shaped by the very myths that were written long after the events unfolded. What we're left with is more of a mystery than a history. And don't get me wrong, the Spartan myth is powerful. It sells books, movies, and even t-shirts. But history? Now that's something far more complicated. To say Sparta was only about military prowess is to ignore the human side of it, the emotions, the struggles, the psychological toll it took on its people. And it's here, in these hidden stories, that we find the real Sparta, the one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Sparta didn't just rise from the bloodshed of war. It came from a place of survival, of building strength in the face of collapse. The real Sparta is the one that emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age collapse, when their ancestors wandered through the broken remnants of a great civilization. Those early Spartans, they weren't just looking to conquer. They were trying to carve out their place in a world that was in total disarray. Think about it. After the fall of the Mycenaeans, nothing was certain. Those that survived had to fight for everything, including their identity. The violence and tragedy of this period aren't just events in history. They're the foundation of the Spartan character we think we know. Let's dive into this. Who were these first Spartans? What made them different? The answers lie in the ancient, untold story of Laconia, a land so harsh it turned ordinary men into legends. These were not just warriors. These were survivors. In the heart of the Peloponnese, the land of Laconia was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Picture it, mountains that rise sharply against a pale sky, fertile plains that can't be tamed easily, and rivers that flood with the rains only to dry up in the heat. It's a place that demands toughness. But how did this barren, challenging landscape give birth to the society we know as Sparta? Simple answer: by forcing people to adapt. Long before the Spartans came to dominate the region, Laconia was home to the Mycenaeans. These were a people who lived in grand palaces, built incredible cities, and left behind stunning works of art. But when the Mycenaean world crumbled, when cities burned and civilizations collapsed, it left behind nothing but ruins. The land was quiet for a long time, almost forgotten. But out of the ashes, a new breed of Greeks, Dorians, emerged. It's this group, the Dorian invaders, who would lay the groundwork for what we think of as Sparta. And no, it wasn't a peaceful arrival. This wasn't the kind of migration we romanticize in modern storytelling. The Dorians came to conquer. They didn't just settle, they took what was theirs by force. Think about it. A society built on aggression, built on conquest. But in those early days, the Spartans weren't the legendary warriors we picture. Instead, they were an emerging people, trying to carve out a place for themselves amidst a world that had already witnessed the collapse of great civilizations. They didn't have time for the luxuries of art and philosophy. They had to survive, and they did, in a way that would make the rest of Greece tremble in fear. But here's the part that's usually glossed over. The real foundation of Sparta wasn't just built on war. It was built on fear. Fear of survival, fear of being wiped off the map, fear of what would happen if they couldn't maintain control. The harsh landscapes of Laconia, the constant threat of rebellion from the conquered peoples, and the pressure to keep expanding and asserting dominance all turned Sparta into a place where strength wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. So, let's step into this world and experience what life would have been like as a young Spartan. Imagine being born into this society. What's expected of you? Power, discipline, and sacrifice. From day one, you're raised in an environment where the idea of weakness is a crime. How did this society come to prioritize survival at all costs? The Spartans didn't just fight for land. They fought for the very essence of their existence. There's something primal about it. But in the end, the Spartans weren't just a group of warriors. They were survivors, building a system where only the strongest survived. And in the brutal world of ancient Greece, survival wasn't a guarantee. It's this aspect of their history, this raw human side of Sparta, that makes their rise so fascinating. They weren't born with swords in their hands. They took them. Now that we've set the stage, let's explore how they went from struggling survivors to the legendary warriors we know today. We'll go deeper into the territorial expansion, military innovations, and social structures that shaped them into a force no one could ignore. Ready to walk the path of Spartan history? Let's continue. Imagine standing at the gates of a thriving city, its grand palace walls towering over you, the sound of bustling life filling the air. For centuries, this place was untouchable. Its kings, its warriors, its riches, all symbols of an empire that was destined to last forever. But then, without warning, the ground beneath your feet trembles. The mighty walls shake. The once grand halls of the palaces crumble into dust. What would it feel like to watch it all unravel? The mighty Mycenaean Empire, gone in the blink of an eye. You think you know how this story ends, right? That collapse is inevitable. But what if I told you it was far worse than you've been led to believe? What if everything we think we know about this fall is a sanitized version of events, hiding the brutality, the panic, the sheer terror of a civilization brought to its knees? The Mycenaeans didn't just collapse. They were torn apart by forces they couldn't even comprehend. Let's talk about power. How does a civilization that once controlled the seas, that had luxuries most could only dream of, just disappear? This wasn't a slow fade. It was a violent, cataclysmic implosion, and the people caught in the middle, they had no choice but to adapt or die. And most of them, they didn't survive. Now let's pause for a moment. Consider the survivors, the ones who walked through the dust, through the ruins. What was left for them? Power had shifted, wealth was gone, and the very identity they once held was shattered. There was no rebuilding Mycenae. Number. The survivors had only one option, to rebuild themselves. But from the ashes of this destruction arose something new, something brutal, something that would go on to shape the very future of Greece. They were called the Dorians, and that, my friend, is where the story gets really interesting. You might think you know where this goes, the rise of Sparta, the fierce warriors, the legends. But hold on. What if the Dorians, the very people who would eventually create Sparta, weren't the noble warriors you think they were? What if they were the invaders, the ones who came in, took what they wanted, and created a ruthless society born out of chaos? And guess what? This isn't just a history lesson. It's a lesson for you. In a world that seems invincible, who survives when everything falls apart? The ones who are willing to be ruthless, the ones who rise from destruction, and that's the Sparta we need to understand. Now, before you rush off to Google Spartan warriors, let me tell you the truth. This story isn't about an ancient army. It's about survival. And the Dorians, they were about to show the Greeks just how brutal survival could get. So who are these Dorians? And how did they change the game? How did a group of outsiders rise from the ruins of the Mycenaean collapse and create a society that would dominate Greece for centuries to come? Let's take a closer look at how the Dorian invasion set the stage for what would become the Sparta we know. The Sparta that would eventually challenge the might of Athens, Persia, and all of Greece. Buckle up because this is where the story really starts to get good. Let's rewind for a second. We're not talking about some mythical warriors who just magically walked into Laconia and took control. No, the truth is far darker and more unsettling. The Dorian invasion was a violent, desperate clash, a fight for survival on a scale that most people today can't even imagine. But somehow, these people, these Dorians, managed to carve out something far greater than mere survival. They forged the foundations of Sparta. But how did it happen? What if I told you that the truth of Sparta's foundation is far more disturbing than the sanitized myth we've all heard? It wasn't a smooth transition. It wasn't, we walked in, we conquered, we built. What we're looking at here is an invasion, a brutal, uncompromising act of war against an already struggling land. But these invaders weren't just fighting for land or power. They were fighting for existence. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? Standing in the ashes of a once great civilization, knowing that you have one shot to make it, or you'll be swallowed whole by history. The Mycenaean world is collapsing. The old ways are dying. And in their place, the Dorians, the Heraclids. These weren't just mythical heroes. They were survivors, desperate to claim what little was left. But they weren't coming to build an empire. They were coming to take one. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for a leader's signal. They didn't have the luxury of time. And this dual monarchy, it wasn't just a fancy political system. It was a lifeline, a way to ensure survival when everything else was crumbling. Eurysthenes and Procles weren't just kings in a time of peace. They were leaders of a desperate struggle. Together, they had to make the impossible happen. And not everyone made it. What if they had failed? The very foundation of Sparta, its kingship, its military might, was in the balance. And the truth? The people of Sparta didn't just accept their rule, they were thrust into it. They had no choice. Either they followed the kings or they died. It wasn't a system built on glory. It was a system built on survival. And the tension was there every day. Here's the twist. For all their talk of honor, for all the bravado, the foundation of Sparta wasn't about legacy. It was about survival. And every decision these kings made could have led to their destruction. The Mycenaeans didn't just fall, they were obliterated. So the question remains, could the Dorians, their descendants, rise from the ashes? Or would they, too, be consumed by the same fate? But we're not done. You've heard the myths. Now let's talk about the real story of Sparta. What came next? What does this brutal foundation mean for the future of Spartan society? How do these kings, these twins, establish a system so unyielding, so strong, that it survives against all odds? The true battle is only just beginning. Stick around, because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about Sparta. The Dorians may have seized the land, but now they face their true challenge, building a society that could endure. What makes Sparta's rise so extraordinary isn't just its military prowess, but the unique, unforgiving social system that would emerge from this violence. In the next chapter, we dive into the birth of Spartan society itself, the brutal yet ingenious methods of creating a community that lived and died by its own unyielding code. How did the Dorians, once invaders, become the world's most feared and disciplined society? Let's find out. What if I told you that the Spartans didn't just happen, that the rise of this legendary society wasn't some peaceful unification of four villages, but a brutal, unforgiving struggle for survival? The truth is, the creation of Sparta wasn't the heroic tale you've been told. It wasn't about destiny or some divine mandate. No, what happened here was more visceral, more dangerous than that. The very foundations of Sparta were built on fear, and fear, my friend, is a hell of a motivator. Imagine being in the dust of Laconia, surrounded by land that seems to stretch forever, but offers little more than rugged terrain and uncertainty. The Dorians, descendants of Heracles, arrived, but they weren't the warriors of myth you've been led to believe. These were men desperate to carve a place in a land that had already witnessed the fall of a great civilization. These weren't conquering heroes, they were invaders, outsiders trying to survive in a world that had already forgotten them. So when the four villages of Pitana, Limni, Messa, and Canasura began to unite, it wasn't some noble act of diplomacy. No, this was about control. Who could dominate? Who would rise to lead this ragtag group of survivors? You think that their coming together was an act of unity? It was an act of sheer survival, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. There was no space for weakness, no room for mercy. You see, the geography of Laconia, fertile plains, strategic positioning, wasn't just convenient, it was vital. The Spartans didn't settle here by chance. They had to settle here. There were no other options. If they failed to consolidate this land, the brutality of the outside world would come crashing down on them. And what do you think would happen then? These leaders, Eurysthenes and Procles, had everything to lose. They couldn't afford to be weak. This wasn't about pride. This was about life or death. But here's the kicker. What if I told you that the unity of these villages, the very birth of Sparta, wasn't the beginning of the story? That's where it starts. But what happens next is far darker, far more sinister. What if I told you that the very foundation of Spartan society was built on oppression? That the key to Sparta's military supremacy, the one thing that allowed it to rise to power, was not just a united front, but the ruthless subjugation of an entire class of people, a class that would come to be known as the Helots? Hold on tight, because what you're about to learn will flip everything you thought you knew about Spartan society. The Helots weren't just slaves. They were the backbone of Sparta's military might. And the structure that kept them in line wasn't just harsh, it was cruel beyond measure. The rise of Spartan society wasn't about honor and valor alone. It was built on the backs of the oppressed. How does a society that claims to value strength live with such dark contradictions? In the next chapter, we dive into the brutal system of control and power that allowed Sparta to dominate Greece, how the Helots were forced to labor, fight, and die for their rulers. And you'll discover that behind Sparta's revered military discipline lies a darker story, one of exploitation and fear. Get ready, because this story is about to get a lot more uncomfortable. What if I told you that the greatest military state in ancient history, the legendary Sparta, wasn't built on the blood of its warriors, but on the backs of the oppressed? What if I told you that the foundation of Spartan society wasn't the strength of its soldiers, but the terror that coursed through the veins of the Helots, the slaves who kept the whole system running? Let's strip away the myth for a moment. The Spartans weren't born with power. They didn't just walk into Laconia and build an empire. They conquered it through violence, through subjugation, through fear. And what did they need to do to keep it all intact? Keep their slaves in check. Picture this, a society built on military discipline and strength, one where the very existence of the ruling elite depends on the suffering of another class of people, the Helots. They were more than slaves. They were the foundation of Sparta. Without them, the Spartan warriors would have been nothing but a hollow shell, their strength meaningless. The terrifying truth, the Spartans knew it. They needed the Helots to survive, but they also feared them, feared that one day the weight of their oppression would break. So what did they do? They created a system of control so brutal, so unyielding, that it made the Helots completely dependent on them, while simultaneously keeping them under control through fear. But here's the catch. The very system that allowed Sparta to thrive was also its greatest weakness. Sparta's military might, it was made possible by its slaves, and if they ever rose up, if they ever broke free, it would be the end of everything. But this isn't just a story of the Spartans. It's the story of how far a society can go to maintain control. The Helots were more than just slaves. They were a ticking time bomb, a force ready to ignite at any moment. The tension, it's unbearable. Can the Spartans keep them down long enough to solidify their power? Or will the oppressed rise and break the back of Spartan dominance? And what of the Spartiates? They weren't just warriors. They were terrified of what would happen if the Helots decided to strike back. And so they built their entire culture around that fear. They turned strength into a system of constant vigilance, where every decision, every battle, was a reflection of this brutal truth. The Spartans could not survive without the Helots, but they also couldn't survive with them either. But here's the twist. This isn't just a story about oppression. The Spartans didn't just control the Helots, they needed them. Their power wasn't just based on fear, it was based on their military might. The Spartans understood that to survive in a world like this, they had to build an army that was unstoppable. And this is where the true story of Spartan strength begins. In the next chapter, we'll uncover how Sparta's brutal social structure gave rise to one of the most feared militaristic states in history. How the agage, the Spartan training system, turned boys into warriors and warriors into legends. Stay tuned, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about Sparta's rise to power. What if I told you that the Spartans weren't the perfect warriors you've been led to believe? What if I told you that beneath their legendary strength and military might was a deep, dark secret, a brutal, unrelenting system that turned young boys into weapons but broke their spirits in the process? Imagine being a child, forced to leave your mother's arms at the age of 7, only to enter a world that will test you in ways unimaginable, where weakness is not just a flaw, it's a death sentence. This wasn't just an army, this was a machine, and every Spartan citizen was just a cog in that machine. But don't be fooled. The real story of Sparta isn't just about warriors and battle tactics. Number. It's about the cost, the sacrifice of perfection. The relentless pursuit of military dominance didn't just create warriors, it created monsters. Monsters forged in sweat, blood, and fear. And the worst part? The people who built this empire were as terrified of the Helots, those they kept chained to the land, as they were of their own weaknesses. The Spartans feared their very foundation would collapse. They feared that one day the chains they put on the Helots would snap, and with them, the entire society would fall apart. You see, Sparta wasn't just a warrior society. It was a society obsessed with strength. Their very identity depended on it. The agage, the training system, wasn't just about military prowess. It was about control. Control over the individual, control over weakness. Every Spartan, from childhood to adulthood, was reduced to one thing, strength. And the cost? Their humanity. Every Spartan child was forced to give up their individuality in exchange for the collective good of their society. No one was allowed to question, to deviate, to doubt. To do so would mean being cast out, becoming nothing. And that was a fate worse than death. But wait, here's the shocker. This terrifying system of control wasn't just the result of military might. No, it came from something much darker, something that you might never expect. The very heart of Sparta, the laws that shaped it, were not born from strength alone. They came from the mind of one man, Lycurgus. Lycurgus wasn't just a lawgiver. He was the architect of the Spartan soul. His constitution didn't just create a system of governance. It created a system of fear. Under Lycurgus's laws, every Spartan would be molded into a tool of the state, and that tool's purpose was simple: fight, conquer, and survive. But what exactly did Lycurgus do to create this world? What kind of laws, what kind of systems did he put in place to ensure that Sparta would become the military powerhouse of Greece? And more importantly, how did his vision, his brutal, unforgiving vision, set the stage for Sparta's eventual downfall? In the next chapter, we'll uncover the man behind the myth, the laws that define Spartan life, and how these laws turned a city into a cold, calculating war machine. But as we dig deeper, we'll ask the question that no one dares ask. Was Lycurgus's vision truly the one that Sparta needed to thrive? Or was it the very thing that condemned them to collapse? What if I told you that the very system of control that Sparta built to survive would eventually suffocate it? That behind the polished myth of Spartan strength lies a fragile, dark truth, a truth that Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, never prepared for. Imagine a society where every breath you take is dictated by a law. Every step, every word, every action, the Spartan system governed it all. But what happens when you push a people too far? What happens when the perfect warriors you create are bred from fear, not honor? The agage, the Spartan education system, wasn't just about physical prowess, number. It was about stripping away the soul, tear away everything that makes you human, and what's left? An obedient machine that moves only when the state commands. You think you're building strength, but what you're really building is a time bomb waiting to explode. The emotional stakes here are enormous, because every Spartan child knows one thing: failure in this system means nothing. You don't just fail, you disappear. And so the pressure mounts, not just for the boys, not just for the warriors, but for everyone who is forced to live in this system. The Spartan system wasn't just brutal, it was necessary. They feared the helots, the slaves that worked the land, because those slaves were the very reason Sparta could function. But what happens when those slaves revolt? What happens when the cracks start to show? And here's the kicker: all this military might, all this strength was founded on a single man's vision, Lycurgus. The problem is, Lycurgus didn't just design a system of governance. He designed a machine, one that was destined to run for as long as it was fed. But the feeding was brutal, and the consequences of starving that machine? Unimaginable. But hold on. Before you start thinking that the Spartans had it all figured out, let's take a sharp turn. Because Lycurgus's vision wasn't just about internal control, it was about expansion. And where do you expand when you've already created the most formidable military force in Greece? You expand outward. But expansion, as Sparta would soon learn, doesn't come without its own cost. The Messenian Wars weren't just battles for land, they were battles for survival. The Messenian Wars would bring Sparta face to face with its greatest weakness and the consequences of building a society based on fear, oppression, and war. The tension? It's unbearable. Stay with us, because what's coming next will make you question everything you thought you knew about Sparta. Their real battle was just beginning. Let me ask you, what does it take to build a kingdom that stands above all others? Power. But power comes at a price. And Sparta's price? Blood. A brutal system of conquest, driven by a military machine that knew no limits. And it was the Messenians, poor and desperate, who paid that price. Imagine being them, watching as your world is slowly crushed beneath the iron heel of Sparta. Your family, your home, all disappearing, just like that, gone. The Spartans wanted Messenia for one thing: its resources, its land, its labor. And the Messenians, they wanted something far more valuable: their freedom. The stakes couldn't be higher. For Sparta, it was about expanding an empire. For the Messenians, it was about surviving. The tension isn't just in the battle for land, it's in the battle for identity, for dignity. How far would you go to defend everything you've ever known? How much would you sacrifice to stay free? And here's the shocker. As the wars raged on, a new force was created, a force that would define Spartan power, but also set in motion its downfall. The Helots, the very people Sparta relied on to sustain its economy, were not just slaves. No, they were a time bomb, ticking away beneath Sparta's rigid society. And when that bomb goes off, well, you'll see. But hold on, this isn't just a story of war and conquest. Because as Sparta expanded and tightened its grip on Messenia, something unexpected happened. What do you do when you've conquered everything? You look inside your society, and that's when the real challenge begins. The system Lycurgus created, rigid, harsh, unyielding, has kept Sparta at the top. But how long can it hold? When the Spartans thought they were at the height of their power, they were actually staring down their greatest challenge yet. Can they maintain the golden age they've built? Stay with us as we uncover the truth about Sparta's golden age and how the very ideals that fueled their rise would eventually tear them apart. Sure, you could stop here. Maybe you've already seen enough of Sparta's glory, right? But before you hit pause, think about this. What if the real story is only beginning? What if everything you think you know about Sparta is about to be turned upside down? Stick around. If you care about how this ends, you're going to want to see what happens next. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Because the moment Sparta starts to collapse is the moment this history gets really interesting. So go ahead, hit that like button, but only if you're ready for the real truth. I'll be waiting to hear what you think in the comments. You think you know Sparta, don't you? But what if I told you that their rise to supremacy wasn't as straightforward as you've been led to believe? What if their victories in battle came at a cost so great that it would change the future of Sparta forever? The truth is, Sparta's rise wasn't just about military victories. It wasn't just about their incredible warriors. No, there was something more dangerous at play. A deep, gnawing fear of losing everything they'd worked so hard to build. And that fear, it was what fueled them to push forward into battle after battle, relentlessly expanding their territory and their influence. Let's look at the Battle of Hysiae, a battle that will surprise you. It wasn't just about winning. It wasn't about being the best. It was a test of existence. Can you imagine being on the losing side of that battle? Watching everything you've known, your culture, your history, your people, slowly disappear under the might of an empire that seems unstoppable? The Spartans are victorious in the Battle of Hysiae, but that victory, it comes with a twist. The Argives, shattered as they may seem, leave behind something far more dangerous than an army. They leave behind a legacy of rage, one that will haunt Sparta for years to come. But that's the thing about victory. It's rarely as sweet as it seems, especially when the consequences follow you like a shadow. Sparta is now the dominant power in the Peloponnese, right? But what if I told you that this dominance, this invincibility they feel, it's a lie? And the very thing that made Sparta a powerhouse might just be their undoing. I mean, think about it. How long can a society based entirely on fear, control, and subjugation hold itself together? How long before that cracks? If you think that Sparta's supremacy is going to go unchallenged, think again. You haven't seen the real enemy yet. The cost of their military dominance is about to reveal itself in a way that will shock you. But hold on a second. While Sparta thinks it's invincible, something even greater is looming on the horizon, a new threat, one that will push them to the edge, forcing them to answer the question that's haunted them for centuries. Can they stand against the might of the Persian Empire? Next, we'll dive into the Persian Wars, where the Spartans will face their most famous battle, Thermopylae. You think you know about the 300? Think again. The truth of what happened there and what it cost Sparta will blow your mind. And what follows on the plains of Plateau? That's where the real story of Spartan glory takes its darkest turn. Are you ready for the shock? Stick around. You won't want to miss this. The thing about Thermopylae, it wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. You thought it was a tragic end, a defeat for the Spartans, the 300 heroes who gave everything in a stand against an empire, wiped out by the Persian war machine. But what if I told you it wasn't a defeat? What if Thermopylae, this moment where Spartans and their allies made their last stand, was actually a spark that set the world on fire? Thermopylae didn't mark the fall of the Spartans. It marked the birth of something even more dangerous. The Persian king Xerxes may have won the battle, but the real cost wasn't felt in the immediate aftermath. It was felt across the entire Greek world. For Xerxes, a man accustomed to ruling an empire with ease, the idea that 300 men could challenge his might didn't sit right. But it wasn't just his pride at stake. His very vision of conquest, the image of an unstoppable Persia, shattered the moment those 300 men stood firm. And when Leonidas and his men fell, it wasn't just their blood that stained the ground. It was a warning to the entire Persian Empire. For Sparta, though, Thermopylae was more than a battle. It was a statement that echoed far beyond the walls of their city, beyond their warriors, and into the hearts of every Greek man who heard the story. The Spartans may have been defeated on the field, but their legacy, their defiance, that lived on. And the entire Greek world would come to realize one thing. To defeat Sparta, you needed to wipe out their ideals, their values, and their courage. What happened next was inevitable. Greece, a fractured world of city-states, could no longer afford to fight each other. The memory of Thermopylae did something remarkable. It unified the Greeks in a way no army could. A shared resolve, one burning desire to never let what happened at Thermopylae fade into the past. But here's the shocking part. The Persian Empire, despite their victory, would soon realize something that would change the fate of all the Greeks forever. Their own fear of losing control would set the stage for a much larger confrontation. Thermopylae wasn't the end. It was the prelude to something far greater. But this wasn't just about a single stand in the narrow pass of Thermopylae. No, this was about the future of Greece itself. And as the Greeks united in the aftermath of Thermopylae, something insidious began to take shape. Sparta, ever the master of warfare, now found itself in a position where victory, True, lasting victory was no longer just about the battlefield. It was about power, influence, and the creation of an empire built not on victory, but on control. And as we'll see, this new era, the rise of Sparta's hegemony, wasn't just about military triumph. It was about what happens when one city-state rises so high that it risks destroying everything that once made it great. Join me now as we dive into the Peloponnesian League, the power struggles, the rivalries, and the eventual cracks that would lead to Sparta's fall from grace. This is Sparta's dark secret. Their greatest victory was also their greatest downfall. Are you ready to see how this all unfolds? Because the real story of Sparta is just beginning. You think you know Sparta, but what if I told you that their most glorious moment, just after their greatest victory, was the beginning of their inevitable fall? What if I told you that the Peloponnesian League, a symbol of Spartan strength, would become its greatest burden? After the Persian Wars, the Spartans stood as giants, revered as the defenders of Greece. But behind that glory was a crack in their foundation. Sparta wasn't just facing external threats. It was beginning to unravel from within. The 5th century saw the rise of Athens, a city-state that was flourishing in its wealth and naval power. Athens wasn't just a rival, it was a living reminder to Sparta of something they couldn't compete with: adaptability. Athens had the luxury of expansion, not just in military power, but in cultural influence. Sparta? Sparta had only one thing: its military. And here's the kicker: that one thing, which had been their strength, was now becoming their weakness. Think about it. Sparta, the land-based powerhouse with its rigid structure, could not compete with Athens' fluid, fast-moving navy. And worse, Sparta's power was built on its ideals: sacrifice, discipline, order. But now that same power was being slowly eaten away by the compromises they were forced to make. So let's talk about those compromises. In a desperate attempt to maintain control, Sparta made an unthinkable alliance with Persia. Persia, the very empire that had once threatened to destroy them. And why did Sparta do it? To survive, to keep its power intact. But every step they took to hold on to dominance chipped away at their ideals. Every deal with Persia was a small betrayal of what Sparta stood for, and it haunted them. You see, Sparta's greatest fear wasn't the Persians or the Athenians. It was losing control. And that fear, it made them desperate. And desperation is a dangerous thing. But what happened next? The truth is, Sparta's greatest asset, its unwavering dedication to their ideals, was the very thing that led to their downfall. The more they tried to control, the more they slipped into a cycle of fragility. Now let's talk about Athens for a second. Athens wasn't just fighting for survival, they were fighting to replace Sparta as the leader of Greece. They had the wealth, the resources, the naval power, everything that Sparta lacked. But more importantly, they had flexibility. Sparta could not afford the luxury of changing its ways. And Athens? They were prepared to capitalize on Sparta's reluctance to adapt. As Sparta's grip on the Peloponnesian League began to weaken, their dependence on Persia became more pronounced. The Spartans, once the proud defenders of Greek values, now found themselves playing both sides, trying to maintain the illusion of control while making deals with the very empire they once fought. The irony: they had gone from resisting tyranny to becoming the very thing they had despised. And the cost of that alliance? Their values. So here we are, Sparta at the peak of its military power, but teetering on the brink of something far worse than defeat. The cracks are beginning to show, but no one wants to face them. Now, just as Sparta thought it had cemented its position as the leader of Greece, the inevitable happens. The very empire they built is crumbling from the inside, And it's not from an external enemy. It's from their own failure to adapt. But what happens when you sacrifice your values for the sake of power? Sparta will soon find out. But there's more. Sparta's rise was not just a story of military might. It was a story of pride, of overreach, and of an unrelenting drive for power that ultimately led to its collapse. Next, we'll dive into the decline of Sparta, where the walls begin to close in, and we see the consequences of their decisions playing out in real time. Do you think Sparta's fall was inevitable? Was it their ideals that doomed them? Or was it simply the weight of their empire? Stick with me as we uncover how the mighty can fall and what it means for those who follow. But what if I told you Sparta's greatest victory, what they fought for, bled for, and died for, was also the very thing that destroyed them? Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Sparta, the greatest warriors of Greece, who defeated Persia, conquered Athens, and crushed their enemies. You'd think victory would mean peace, right? But here's the shocking truth. Sparta's hard-earned victory was the beginning of their disaster. What if I told you the price of Spartan glory wasn't just blood on the battlefield? It was the slow rot of everything they stood for, their discipline, their values, their very soul. Think about this for a second. Sparta won, yes, but their victory was built on a lie. They compromised everything that made them Sparta. They made an alliance with Persia, for goodness sake, an empire they once fought tooth and nail to defeat. The very thing that was supposed to be Sparta's greatest strength, independence and self-sufficiency, became their weakness. Victory? Sure. But at what cost? Let's get real for a moment. Sparta wasn't just fighting Athens, they were fighting themselves. Think about it. The Peloponnesian War was never just about Athens versus Sparta. It was a cultural war. Athens, the land of a democracy, philosophy, and the arts, had its own version of what it meant to be strong. And then there was Sparta, the land of military might, rigid discipline, and a soul-crushing focus on battle. But the world was changing. The idea of power was changing. So when Athens, led by Pericles, built a fleet that could cut through the seas like a knife through butter, Sparta stood helpless. They couldn't adapt. All they knew was land warfare. And what did they do? They made the decision that would haunt them forever. They reached out to Persia, the empire they despised. But before you judge them, consider this. What would you do if your entire way of life was about to collapse? The Spartans, proud and stubborn, had no choice. They had to win. They couldn't let Athens destroy their legacy. They had to hold on to power by any means necessary. And this, my friend, is where it all starts to go wrong. They made a deal with the devil, Persia. Sparta, the beacon of self-reliance, had to surrender its soul to secure victory. They sold their values for survival. Now let's talk about the cost. The Peloponnesian War was more than just a military conflict. It was a brutal, unforgiving clash of ideologies. The rise of Athenian intellectual freedom versus Spartan militaristic discipline. But when the dust settled, what did Sparta actually win? Yes, they won the war. But did they really win? Sparta had crushed Athens, but they left the city-state in ruins. Athens, once a powerhouse, now lay broken, its democracy shattered. So what did Sparta do next? They didn't just claim victory. They imposed oligarchy on Athens and the other Greek city-states. They made sure the defeat wasn't just political, it was cultural. They rewrote the rules, but here's the thing. The victory didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow, because Sparta had won the war, but they couldn't win the peace. The war had drained them, their values, their culture, even their sense of identity. Are you shocked yet? You should be, because this is where the real story begins. Sparta, once the mightiest power in Greece, now found themselves standing on the edge of an abyss. The cost of war wasn't just physical, it was moral. And now the very thing they feared most was about to come true. Their empire was crumbling from the inside. For the first time, Sparta was forced to ask themselves, what now? How could they maintain control when their values were starting to erode? How could they hold on to power when the system they fought so hard to create was becoming unsustainable? In the aftermath of the war, the proud warriors of Sparta found themselves facing a harsh reality. Victory had come, but it was empty. And soon they would find that no matter how many battles they won, the real enemy was time. Time would be their undoing. But there's something even more tragic than this hollow victory. Sparta, now at the peak of its power, would soon learn that its greatest threat wasn't Athens, Persia, or any foreign enemy. It was the decay within. What happens when the warrior ethos becomes its own worst enemy? As you'll see next, Sparta's greatest enemy wasn't another city-state, it was itself. Stay with me because what happens next isn't just the fall of Sparta, it's the unraveling of everything they held dear. How does a society built on discipline, honor, and military might slowly begin to fall apart? You're about to find out. But brace yourself. The story of Sparta's decline will shock you. But what if I told you Sparta's greatest enemy wasn't the Athenians, the Persians, or even time itself, but the very things that made them great? What if the Spartans, the most disciplined warriors the world had ever seen, didn't fall because of an enemy, but because they became their own worst enemy? That's right. At the very peak of their power, when Sparta had crushed Athens, secured the Peloponnesian League, and stood as the undisputed military master of Greece, their real battle had already been lost. Not on the battlefields, but in their hearts. Because when you look closely, Sparta didn't just lose a war, they lost their soul. So how does the most disciplined, militaristic society in the world go from invincible to crumbling into ruins? How does the greatest warrior nation in history become an empire that collapses under its own weight? It starts when the Spartans, so accustomed to the hardship and valor of battle, become seduced by the very luxuries they once despised. The year is 404 BCE. Sparta has just emerged victorious over Athens in the Peloponnesian War. The great Spartan warriors have conquered Athens, destroyed their rival, and secured dominance in Greece. You'd think this is a moment of glory. The city is buzzing with excitement. Victory has come at last. But beneath the surface, a more disturbing truth begins to unravel. At the heart of this victory lies a truth few could have predicted. Victory, after all, is an intoxicating drug. It gives the illusion of immortality, of power that can't be touched. But that very high comes with a cost, one that no one in Sparta was prepared to pay. Imagine the scene. Spartan soldiers, hardened by battle, celebrated in their military barracks, their bodies worn and tired from years of war. For the first time in decades, they are no longer hungry, no longer deprived. For the first time, they can relax. But when they turn from their weapons, what do they find? Gold, fine cloth, spices, food, wine, women. The very luxuries they'd fought so hard to avoid now seem irresistible. What happens to the warriors who have spent their entire lives eating barely enough to survive, sleeping on the cold ground, training relentlessly, and facing death with nothing but honor and loyalty? Now they find themselves surrounded by pleasures, things they once despised. As the feast continues, the clinking of golden cups fills the air. Spartan generals, their muscles still bulging from their training, sit back and enjoy the comfort of excess. They drink wine from goblets that are not made of wood or clay, but of gold. the same gold they had once fought to protect their homes from. They are no longer the humble warriors of old. They have become what they always hated. The very thing that made them Spartan, their discipline, is beginning to rot. But this isn't just about luxury, it's about the corruption of their values. Spartan society, once a machine built on sacrifice, honor, and unwavering loyalty, is now slowly transforming. No longer is strength measured by sacrifice, it's measured by wealth. The luxuries aren't just indulgences, they are poison. And it's here, in this moment of excess, that the great collapse begins. What was once a society founded on collective strength, the unity of warriors, is now being undone by individual desire. The warrior ethos is replaced by self-indulgence. The very men who once lived for the collective good now live for their own pleasures. But the human cost of this transformation is far more devastating than the Spartans realize. They're not just losing discipline, they're losing the very thing that made them Spartans, the brotherhood. But as Sparta rises in wealth, something darker is happening in the fields outside the city. The Helots, those oppressed workers who toiled away for centuries to make Sparta rich, are watching. They've been humiliated for generations. They've been crushed under the boot of Spartan rule. But now they begin to notice something. The Spartans, who have long held them in subjugation, are no longer as strong as they once were. The Helots' oppression was once absolute. But now, as the Spartans indulge in their wealth and forget the very discipline that held their society together, the Helots begin to ask themselves, what would happen if we rose up? And that question echoes through the hills and valleys of Laconia. The Helots aren't just the slaves of Sparta, they are the danger lurking at the heart of it all. But what happens when the most disciplined army in the world forgets the cost of their empire? What happens when the oppressed finally see a crack in the armor? The city-state of Sparta, once a symbol of strength, is beginning to decay from within. The discipline that defined them is replaced by laziness. The unity of the warriors is splintering. Even their warrior spirit, the very essence of what it meant to be Spartan, is being diluted by a life of indulgence. The irony is bitter. The very thing Sparta fought so hard to protect, their way of life, is being undone by their own hands. And what's worse, they can't even see it happening. The very luxury they sought after is now turning into their moral destruction. But the true fall of Sparta is yet to come. The cracks in their foundation are now undeniable. The men who once stood tall, their bodies hardened by the weight of their values, are now bowing to pleasure, and it's destroying them from the inside. But here's the twist. This isn't the end yet. The worst is still to come. Sparta, like so many empires before it, thought their strength lay in their military might and wealth. But as you'll see in the next chapter, the real enemy was never the Persians, the Athenians, or even the Helots. The real enemy was time itself, and the slow rot that comes with forgetting what made Sparta great in the first place. Stay tuned for the dramatic fall of Sparta, a story that will shock you and reveal how even the mightiest can fall prey to their own flaws. As we move forward, we'll uncover how Sparta, once the undisputed power of Greece, slowly lost its grip on everything that made it unconquerable. The warriors who fought so hard to protect their city became its very undoing. And soon the unthinkable will happen. Sparta, once a symbol of military supremacy, will face the ultimate collapse. But what caused this collapse? What is it about Sparta's values, once the strongest in Greece, that led to their downfall? Stay with us as we move into the dark chapter of Sparta's decline. The Battle of Leuctra, 371 BCE. It was supposed to be just another day in Sparta's long history of invincibility. But that day would forever shatter the myth of their supremacy. The question is, how did these once great warriors, those who had defeated Persia, subdued Athens, and built an empire, succumb to a force they never saw coming? And even more terrifying, what if the real reason they lost wasn't Thebes, or even the battle itself, but something far darker, something inside Sparta that had been growing for generations? You might think you know the story of Spartan glory. You've heard of their hoplites, their warriors who stood shoulder to shoulder, unshakable. But here's the truth. The battle that ended their reign wasn't just a defeat, it was a reckoning, the result of decades of overconfidence, of forgetting that strength doesn't come from might alone, but from the will to adapt. The Thebans didn't just defeat Sparta, they broke its very spirit. Imagine this. You've spent your life believing you were invincible, unbreakable, superior. Every Spartan soldier was trained from the age of 7 to uphold this myth. Their mothers told them to return from battle either with their shield or on it. There was no room for failure. And yet, when the Battle of Leuctra began, something unexpected happened. The myth of Spartan superiority collapsed. Epaminondas of Thebes, a man few had heard of, employed a new strategy. And with that, the entire Spartan way of life was shattered. It wasn't just that they lost, it was the how. The Spartans were defeated by their own overconfidence, by the belief that their might would always overcome any challenger. But here's the real kicker. When the dust settled, Sparta had lost far more than a battle. What was stripped away in that moment was the very foundation of their society. The soldiers didn't just lose on the field, they lost their purpose. Imagine the horror that must have set in. The warriors who had once felt the invincible rush of victory now had to reckon with a truth that gnawed at them. They were no longer the best. What does it feel like to lose everything you've been taught to believe in? To have your identity, your very reason for existing, shattered by something you never saw coming? These warriors who had been trained to endure, to sacrifice, to live and die by the sword, now found themselves questioning everything. For a Spartan soldier, this defeat wasn't just physical, it was existential. The psychological scars of Leuctra were deeper than the wounds of war. How do you return home after that? How do you face your family, your fellow citizens, after seeing your superiority crumble before you? In the aftermath of Leuctra, something inside Sparta began to rot. This wasn't just about losing a battle. It was about losing the core values that had defined Sparta for centuries. Once known for its discipline, its stoicism, its rigorous military training, Sparta began a shift. The warrior ethos, once sacred, was now questioned. The very things that had given Sparta its edge, its self-denial, its rigorous training, its military purity, were being traded for something else. Here's the twist. The Spartans, having won all their battles, were now beginning to lose their war with themselves. As their empire grew, so did their access to luxury. They were no longer the same Spartan warriors who slept on the cold earth, who endured the harshest conditions. They were becoming soft. They were becoming human. And what does luxury do to a warrior society? It breeds complacency. And it's not just about the material wealth. It's about the decay of character, the slow erosion of everything that made Sparta great in the first place. As the soldiers indulged in pleasures they once rejected, they forgot the most important thing, the reason they fought. In the years following Leuctra, Sparta wasn't just dealing with external threats. They were fighting a far more dangerous battle internally. The Helots, the enslaved population that had long powered Spartan society, were now beginning to see a glimmer of opportunity. The Spartans, once the proud keepers of their lands, were now divided. Wealth was accumulating in the hands of a few, while the once proud warrior elite grew weaker by the day. Their core values, unity, brotherhood, sacrifice, were beginning to decay under the weight of their own success. In the final analysis, Sparta had become a victim of its own hubris. The very thing that had made them strong now led to their downfall. And the lesson is brutally simple. Even the mightiest can fall, not because they were defeated by an enemy, but because they lost themselves. As Macedon loomed in the distance, the broken Sparta was about to face a new power, one that would leave nothing but ruins in its wake. But that's a story for another time. What happens when a society broken from within faces a new force that sees opportunity in its weakness? And when you hear about Philip II, Alexander the Great, and their rise, don't just think of a new empire. Think of the final moments of Sparta, their last desperate attempts to retain their dominance. The rise of Macedon will mark the beginning of the end for Sparta. As their military power fades and their wealth grows, they'll eventually become a shadow of their former selves. But even then, Sparta's story isn't over. Under Roman rule, the city that once struck fear into the hearts of enemies will become a relic, a museum of its glorious past. But what happens when Rome, the greatest empire the world has ever known, takes control of Sparta? The final chapter of Spartan history will shock you. Stay with us as we unravel the decline of Sparta and its transformation into an echo of its former self under the weight of Roman power. The year is 222 BCE. Spartan warriors, once the undisputed masters of the Greek battlefield, find themselves facing the one enemy they can't defeat, themselves. But is it really their fault? They have been shaped by their own myth, the myth of invincibility. And now this very myth is being shattered before their eyes. With Macedon on the rise, Cleomenes III tries to reignite the old Spartan fire. But what if I told you that Sparta's greatest defeat wasn't just on the battlefield, but in the very heart of its own society? Can a warrior ever accept the truth that their power is no more? Let's pause for a moment. The Spartan warriors, the same men who once stood shoulder to shoulder, knowing nothing but victory, are now staring into the abyss of their own irrelevance. Thebes crushed their pride, and Macedon, led by Philip II, now threatens to erase the city-state altogether. But it isn't just Macedon that's their downfall. It's something much darker. It's the weight of pride and the unbearable burden of tradition. For centuries, Sparta stood as the epitome of military excellence. But now they must face the uncomfortable truth. Their greatest weapon was no longer invincibility, but arrogance. The same discipline, strength, and unity that once made them a force to be reckoned with are now the chains that bind them to their downfall. Their rigid way of life, their adherence to unquestioned traditions, was exactly what had led them to this point. Enter Cleomenes III, a king born into a broken Sparta, desperate to restore the city's lost glory. But could one man really bring Sparta back? It's easy to see him as a hero, a man willing to challenge tradition, take on the oligarchs, and redistribute land to the common people. But his ambition is his undoing. Cleomenes wasn't just fighting Macedon, he was fighting the very soul of Sparta itself. The Spartan elite, long accustomed to their wealth and power, would not give up easily. They fought Cleomenes at every turn, fearing that his reforms would undermine their control. What does a warrior do when his greatest enemies are not on the battlefield, but in the very halls of power he seeks to reshape? The tension mounts as Cleomenes realizes that Sparta's true enemy isn't Philip II or the Macedonian army. It's the lack of unity, the internal divisions that have been festering for years. The grand vision he holds for Sparta, the one that could return them to their former glory, seems increasingly like a pipe dream. How can one man face a civilization bent on its own decay? Everything comes to a head in 222 BCE at the Battle of Silesia. This is Sparta's last stand. Cleomenes has reformed his military, strengthened his alliances, and prepared for battle. But will it be enough? The battle begins. The tension is palpable. The Spartans, despite their reformations, are no longer the warriors they once were. Their hoplite advantage is fading, and they are facing a well-oiled Macedonian war machine, bolstered by allied forces. The sounds of battle echo through the hills, swords clashing, shields crashing, men crying out in pain. The air is thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and desperation. Sparta, a society built on unwavering strength, is now fighting a battle against its own inability to adapt. The new tactics of Macedon, led by Antigonus III, begin to show their superiority. The Macedonian phalanx cuts through the Spartan lines like a knife through butter. But what's truly staggering isn't just the loss on the battlefield, it's the psychological shock. For the first time, the Spartan warrior ethos meets its match. No matter how hard they fight, no matter how much they believe in their cause, they cannot overcome the reality. They are no longer the dominant power. Cleomenes, despite his heroic efforts, is forced to retreat. The battle is lost, and with it, Sparta's hope for a resurgence. The once unstoppable warriors of Sparta are now reduced to a defeated remnant. And here's the cruel irony. Sparta won in theory. They were victorious in their quest to regain independence and dignity, but the price was too steep. Cleomenes' defeat didn't just mark the loss of the battle, it signaled the end of Spartan autonomy. His failed revolution signaled that Sparta's power was not just external, but internal. The rot had set in long before Macedonia arrived. In the aftermath, Sparta is a broken state. The citizens return to their lives, but nothing is the same. The once proud warriors are now no better than mercenaries. The helots, the very backbone of Spartan society, continue their grueling labor. But the power of the Spartan citizen soldier has diminished. And worse, the idea of Spartan supremacy begins to fade into the past. The world moves on, and Sparta, once the heart of the Greek military, is now a mere shadow of itself. But here's where the shocking twist comes in. While the world thinks of Sparta as a spent force, something unexpected is about to happen. Sparta may have lost the Battle of Silesia, but it hasn't lost its legacy. The world remembers Sparta, not for its final defeat, but for what it once was. And as we'll see, the legacy of Sparta will haunt those who defeated it. The shadow of Sparta looms over future generations, even under the rise of Macedon and eventually Rome. So, what happens when Sparta, finally defeated, is swallowed whole by Macedon and then Rome? How does a once mighty empire reconcile itself with the brutal truth of decline? Stay with us as we delve into the next phase of Spartan history. The fate of Sparta under Roman rule might surprise you. From a proud warrior city-state to a mere relic of its past, the fall of Sparta will be a tale not just of military defeat, but of cultural annihilation. This is the story of how the last embers of Spartan pride were extinguished, and what remained of Sparta after its fall. Imagine standing at the edge of a city-state that has defined the very concept of power, resilience, and unyielding strength. For centuries, Spartan warriors, men who had mastered death itself, ruled the battlefields, their spirits as indomitable as their iron wills. But in the year 222 BCE, this pride, the foundation of Sparta's very identity, was broken in an unexpected way. What happened when Sparta, the invincible, bent the knee? What happens when a warrior state becomes a tool in someone else's empire? What happens when everything you fought for is taken away, piece by piece, until your very name becomes a relic of the past? To understand the tragedy of Sparta's decline under Roman rule, we must first understand the crushing weight of defeat. Sparta was built on the premise that its warriors, the Spartiates, could never be defeated. That myth was shattered after the Peloponnesian War, but it wasn't until Cleomenes III took the reins in the 3rd century BCE that Sparta tried to reclaim its lost pride. The king's ambition was clear: restore Sparta's military strength, purge the corrupt oligarchs, and bring about a new age of Spartan supremacy. But the human stakes were high. Cleomenes was haunted by the very concept of failure. Could a man born into the legacy of invincibility ever accept that his people were no longer the top dogs? What does a leader do when the very values that made him a hero now betray him? The answer: he becomes a man desperate to make his mark. Cleomenes' reforms, radical as they were, showed a deeper psychological conflict within Sparta. While he fought to re-establish a warrior state, the elite and the traditions of old rejected him. The same warriors he sought to protect now betrayed him. His journey into the labyrinth of betrayal wasn't just a political struggle. It was an internal battle, one against the very foundation of Spartan identity. And so we find ourselves watching Cleomenes in the midst of his personal war, a war that he ultimately lost. Could he have led Sparta back into glory? Or did his pride blind him to the reality that times had changed? Now, the Macedonian Empire may have defeated Sparta in battle, but it was Rome that had the final word. And it wasn't with swords, it was with alliances. The very thought of Sparta aligning with the Romans is enough to make you shudder. Rome, the rising empire that had no regard for the ideals of honor or warrior traditions, was about to swallow Sparta whole. Imagine the feeling of a Spartan warrior, once the undisputed master of the battlefield, now relegated to a puppet state in service to Rome. But Sparta's pride wasn't going to disappear quietly. No, the symbolism of a Spartan warrior had a power all its own. What Rome couldn't defeat outright, it would co-opt. Sparta became a cultural curiosity, a historical relic under Roman rule. Imagine the sight: Spartan ruins, once bustling with warriors, now serving as tourist attractions for Roman citizens who marveled at the faint remnants of a glory they could never fully understand. And yet, while the political Spartan state died under Roman hands, what happened next was even more shocking. The city that had once produced legions of warriors now sat in the shadow of its former self, a place where Roman elites came to tour. Spartan identity, the very essence of its pride, became a distant memory, a curiosity for the learned few. But how did Sparta, the great warrior culture, succumb to this fate? Imagine the conversations between Roman scholars and visiting tourists as they walked the ruins of Sparta. What could they have said? Perhaps they wondered how such a once great state fell so swiftly, how pride, once Sparta's greatest strength, became its greatest weakness. How in a world where change happens rapidly, did Sparta fail to adapt? And here's the real kicker. We look back on Sparta today, not as a living empire, but as a warning. The rise and fall of Sparta is a lesson. Do not become so proud that you can't change. Rome's conquest wasn't just military, it was a systematic stripping of Sparta's identity, of its very soul. When the pride of a people fades, who are they left to be? And this is where the tragedy of Sparta touches us all. The real question is, what happens when a culture's pride turns into its downfall? In today's world, where we witness countries, cultures, and empires fight to maintain their identity, Sparta's loss of independence under Rome's shadow carries profound consequences. Just as Sparta was swallowed by Roman imperialism, so too might we find ourselves swallowing our own pride in the face of modern challenges. But here's the twist you won't expect. Even after the fall, Sparta's spirit didn't die. How could it? The legacy of Spartan discipline, honor, and unity continues to influence the world today in unexpected ways. And though Sparta fell to Rome, the legacy of the warrior spirit still lingers, even in places you might not think to look. Stay tuned as we reveal how the warrior ethos of Sparta, its endurance, its commitment to unity, and its undying pride, lives on in a world far beyond the ancient ruins. Will Sparta's legacy rise again? You won't believe how this story ends. Sparta is dead, or is it? Imagine standing on the battlefield of Thermopylae, 480 BCE. The sun is low in the sky, casting long shadows over the blood-soaked earth. 100,000 Persian soldiers, armed to the teeth, are charging toward you. And there you stand, 300 men in the shadow of your king, with nothing but your shields and your unbreakable resolve. You know the end is inevitable, but it's not just the battle you're fighting. It's the idea of Sparta itself, the spirit of it, that you must protect. What kind of man chooses to die for that ideal? And more importantly, what kind of culture demands such sacrifice? Thermopylae is where Sparta's story isn't just told through swords or shields, it's told through ideas. We talk about the 300, those nearly immortal figures led by King Leonidas, but we miss the point if we don't understand the full weight of what they were doing. This wasn't about military tactics. This was a death march to defend a culture, the very essence of Spartan identity. These men knew they were dead the moment they took their positions in that narrow pass. So why did they stay? Why not run when the Persian army outnumbered them hundreds of times over? The answer is not simple. It's not just about loyalty to Leonidas or honor. It's a complex web of psychological pressure, military ethos, and cultural pride. The men of Sparta had been trained since childhood. Their lives had been shaped by the relentless Spartan system to prepare them for this exact moment. Their entire identity was wrapped up in the notion of sacrifice. In that brutal moment, they weren't just dying for their king, they were dying for the legacy of Sparta itself. Imagine the weight on Leonidas' shoulders. As the king, the man who led these warriors to certain death. His role as king wasn't about authority alone. His leadership was spiritual. He was the embodiment of the Spartan ideal, and it was his resolve, his understanding that, for Sparta's survival, these men had to die, that kept him standing at the front lines. As he looked into the eyes of his men, what did he see? Was there fear? Did any of them wish to turn away from the oncoming storm? This wasn't just a battle of military tactics. It was a battle of identity. These warriors believed that to die for Sparta was to live forever. They embraced death not as the end, but as the ultimate expression of their duty to the city-state. The thrill of battle was never the point for them. It was the grind of maintaining honor against insurmountable odds. And that's why we're still talking about them today. But here's the twist. What happens when a culture dedicated to sacrifice and stoicism meets the brutal realities of the modern world? What if the very ethos that defines Sparta, their unyielding discipline, their martial pride, their absolute self-reliance becomes a burden? Is it possible that Sparta's ideal of strength, forged in battle, is the very thing that cripples it in the end? And more chillingly, could we be walking down the same path today, obsessed with the costs of honor and strength, without seeing the costs of that very pursuit? Sparta's true legacy is not in its warriors, but in the spirit it created, a spirit of unwavering resolve in the face of overwhelming odds. And today that spirit isn't confined to the ruins of Thermopylae, it's embedded in our culture. The Spartan ethos has been repackaged by the modern world, celebrated as the ideal soldier mentality. But what happens when that ideal is distorted, or worse, misused? We see it in the military, in sports culture, in personal development, everywhere. The lessons of Sparta are everywhere around us, but how many of us truly understand what that spirit demands? How many of us would make the ultimate sacrifice if we were faced with a similar fate? Are we still asking the question, what would a Spartan do? Or have we missed the point entirely? Stay with us as we explore what happened to Sparta's legacy, how it evolved from an idealized image of unbreakable strength to a modern myth, and how that myth still shapes our world today. The real question remains, is the Spartan spirit, one of extreme discipline and sacrifice, still the path forward for us? Or has it become a shadow of a past that no longer applies in a world of modern complexities? Don't miss what comes next. Sparta's influence lives on today, but how much longer can we cling to a myth when the world demands that we evolve? Imagine, just for a second, what it must have been like to live as a Spartan warrior. Your life has been rigorously controlled from the moment you could walk. Every breath, every step, every decision dictated by the very culture that raises you to fight, die, and sacrifice for the state. But behind the stoic mask, what were the true costs of this way of life? A glorified warrior class, so revered for their military prowess, yet so stripped of humanity in the name of duty. And what about the helots, the enslaved? Their very existence depended on their oppression. What happens when that kind of system breaks, and who pays the price? Let's dive into the reality of Sparta, a reality far darker than the myth we know. If you've ever pictured the Spartan warrior as a symbol of undying discipline, self-sacrifice, and glory, think again. Because while the Spartans' strength in battle was legendary, the society that bred such warriors was not built on simple pride. It was built on oppression, fear, and an unflinching demand for loyalty to the state at the expense of everything else. Let's talk about the helots. These weren't just slaves in the traditional sense. They were the backbone of Spartan society, trapped in a cycle of fear, constantly under threat of brutal punishment or death if they dared to rebel. But they were also necessary for Sparta's very existence. Without them, Sparta's military power, its warrior society, would collapse. The helots, though unseen by most Spartans, were the silent engines that kept the Spartan system in motion. Imagine being born into a world where your life is not your own, where every waking moment is spent fearing for your life, forced to work for a system that sees you as less than human. But even more terrifying, you are outnumbered, knowing that at any moment the power dynamics could shift and you could either rebel or die trying. Now let's talk about the Spartiates. These were the warriors, the elite. Trained from childhood in the agog, they lived by one single mantra: fight, conquer, and die for Sparta. But the Spartan identity wasn't just about valor in battle, it was about endurance. What does it take to raise a child to be nothing but a soldier, to give them no opportunity for individuality or personal growth? In Sparta, the system of control was so absolute that even the greatest Spartan warriors couldn't escape it. Every soldier was a tool, a part of the machine, conditioned to believe that there was no higher purpose than service to the state. And this is where the contradiction becomes clear. Sparta's warriors were powerful, yes, but they were also nothing more than slaves to the system they had created. The question then is this: Was this unshakable discipline, this unyielding commitment to honor, really worth it? The Spartans had built an empire of soldiers, each willing to die for the glory of the state. Yet in doing so, they had created a society that was unsustainable, one that fed on slavery and oppression to maintain its strength. The truth that most people don't understand about Sparta is that their warriors weren't truly free. They had no choice but to serve. Their identity was forged in the fire of obedience, and that was the very thing that kept them from being human. Spartan warriors, despite their legendary valor, lived in fear, not of their enemies, but of the very system that defined their lives. The courage we celebrate in figures like Leonidas wasn't just about standing firm against overwhelming odds. It was about being trapped in a system that demanded sacrifice. And that system, as strong as it was in battle, was built on a lie that said strength in battle was worth more than the freedom of a human being. So here's the million-dollar question. What happens when a culture so devoted to the ideal of strength finally faces its own weakness? We know how the story ends. Sparta falls, but not in the way we've been taught. It wasn't just the Persians, the Thebans, or the Macedonians that destroyed Sparta. It was Sparta's own ideals, those same virtues we admire, that crushed them from within. The very things that made them great warriors became the force of their undoing. And the scariest part? We still celebrate the Spartan myth today, holding up the same values of sacrifice and military discipline as the ultimate virtues. But what if we're missing the point? What if, in our pursuit of strength, we're sacrificing the very freedom that makes us human? Imagine standing on the edge of a battlefield, your breath heavy, your sword gripped tight, and the weight of generations of Spartan warriors bearing down on your shoulders. The weight of your ancestors' expectations, your entire society's ideology, all pressing you to fight, conquer, and never question the price. But here's the shocking truth. What if everything you've been told about Spartan greatness was a lie? Sparta was not just a city of warriors. It was a tragedy, a society built on unimaginable sacrifice, silent suffering, and a cruel system that, in the end, devoured itself. At the heart of Sparta's strength was their unquestionable discipline, an obsession with military perfection that began before birth. It was in their swords, in their training, in the very fabric of their society. And yet, for all their pride in their unbeaten warriors, what were they really fighting for? Was it truly the glory of Sparta? Or was it the survival of a brutal system that had nothing to offer but war and sacrifice? From the moment a Spartan child entered the agoge, they were destined to lose everything. Their identity, their humanity, everything was stripped away to mold them into machines of war. This wasn't about honor. This was about obedience and control. And the worst part? This militarized lifestyle wasn't just necessary for survival, it was celebrated. Sacrifice for the state became their mantra, and yet few would dare to ask, what happens to the human soul when it's told to die for a cause it barely understands? But behind every Spartan hero stood the helots, the enslaved workers, bound to the land, fated to live and die under the shadow of their Spartan masters. Imagine a life where your every movement is dictated by fear, fear of punishment, fear of death, fear of rebellion. These slaves weren't mere workers. They were the lifeblood of Spartan society, the silent engine that kept the war machine running. Yet they weren't just enslaved, they were dehumanized, and every day was a reminder that their existence was not their own. And the worst part? The Spartans knew it. They knew that their military glory and strength were built on oppression, but they chose to ignore the moral cost. Sparta's mighty warriors lived in a world where sacrifice was glorified, but it wasn't their sacrifice on the line. When Sparta met its first defeat, it was like a slow burn. The decline didn't come with a dramatic crash, but with the slow crumbling of their very identity. Sparta's military dominance, built on a foundation of brutal training and slavery, began to fall apart. The hoplite system, once the backbone of their success, was no longer enough to save them. And why? Because they had neglected the human element. They had turned their soldiers into tools, tools of war, but not tools of growth, of creativity, or of progress. Sparta had sacrificed its soul in the name of military excellence. Yet the worst irony is that Sparta's true downfall was not on the battlefield, but in their refusal to adapt, in their inability to face the reality of what their society had become. As Sparta lost more battles, as their hoplites failed, they tried to cling to their glory. They kept fighting, but they didn't understand the fight had changed. Their system wasn't sustainable anymore. Now ask yourself this: what did the Spartans die for? Were they truly heroes, or were they just victims of their own system, a system they never dared question? Sparta's enduring myth, their discipline, their valor, their sacrifice for the state, has been worshipped and glorified for centuries. But what if we've been celebrating a dangerous ideal all along? What if the values that made Sparta great were the very values that led to their downfall? This isn't just a question for history buffs, it's a question for us today. The Spartan ideal still resonates. Look at how we treat soldiers, how we worship military strength, how we preach sacrifice. But are we truly learning from the Spartan collapse, or are we condemning ourselves to repeat their mistakes? What happens when we forget the human cost of our ideals? In the end, Spartan greatness was not built on heroism, it was built on a lie. And as we look at the military and political systems today, are we still living under the shadow of Sparta's ideals? Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, watching your comrades march to their deaths, the sounds of battle echoing, the ground shaking beneath you as you prepare for your own sacrifice, a sacrifice for the state, for the greater good. But as you march, you can't shake the question, what are we truly fighting for? This was Sparta, a society built on the iron principle of discipline, yet teetering on the edge of destruction because of the very values it held dear. It wasn't the Persians, or the Thebans, or even the Macedonians who brought Sparta down. No, it was their own unbending system, a system that demanded everything, yet gave nothing in return. You know the legend: 300 Spartans standing at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, fighting for their land, their honor. The world remembers Leonidas and his warriors as heroes, but we forget what they died for. They fought not just for freedom, but for the glory of Sparta, a city-state founded on the principles of obedience, strength, and sacrifice. Principles that demanded everything and left nothing for the individual. But what if this wasn't just heroism? What if it was a trap? What if the very ideals that the Spartans held so dear were the cause of their downfall? Every Spartan knew the price of glory. To live as a Spartan was to be sacrificed, and it was an ideal that demanded absolute loyalty, absolute obedience, and an eternal sacrifice, not just of body, but of mind and spirit. The cost of Sparta's greatness wasn't just paid on the battlefield, it was paid in the hearts of the people, crushed by a society that glorified militarism and discipline, but offered nothing in return. The very system that created the world's most feared warriors eventually devoured itself, and in the process, it left behind a society that couldn't adapt, couldn't survive. As the Spartans marched to war, their victories, though legendary, came at a terrible price. The Helots, the enslaved workers who kept Sparta's agricultural engine running, were more than just an oppressed class. They were the unseen force holding the city together. They worked the land, they provided the food, and they suffered in silence. But there were cracks in the system, rebellions, uprisings, and the constant tension between the Spartans and their slaves. The more Sparta's power grew, the more desperate the Helots became to break free. And when they did, when they finally rebelled, the very foundation of Sparta's empire shook. Can you imagine it? A warrior society that needed the labor of an oppressed population to function, and yet never considered that oppression might one day turn against them? The Helots didn't just toil, they resented their Spartan overlords. And when they rose up, it wasn't just a battle for freedom, it was the end of an era. And yet, even as Sparta began to falter, they refused to adapt. When the tide turned, when their military might began to wane, and the balance of power shifted, the Spartans remained steadfast in their ideals, never questioning the very system that had made them great. Their leaders, like Cleomenes III, tried to revive Sparta's old glory, but by then it was too late. The world had changed, but Sparta had not. Imagine the feeling of defeat as Sparta, once the ruler of the Greek world, fell into the shadows of its past glory. Spartan pride was their most prized possession, but it became their greatest curse. They had no room for change, no room for compromise. Instead of evolving, they clung to the idea of sacrifice, of militaristic purity, but it only left them weaker, isolated, and vulnerable to a new power, Rome. And then came Rome, the empire that would finally break Sparta's will. Sparta, once the land of warrior kings, became nothing more than a museum of its former self, a place for tourists to walk the streets where once greatness lived. The Spartan ideals, so celebrated for centuries, were reduced to legend, not even a shadow of their former glory. But in the end, Sparta's fall wasn't just about the Romans. It was about their own refusal to change, their reluctance to evolve. It was a society that placed glory above humanity, and eventually it was the human cost of that glory that led to their collapse. The cost of glory, the cost of unquestionable discipline, of a militaristic society that demanded absolute sacrifice, was too great. Sparta's pride, the very thing they cherished most, ultimately led to their disintegration. And yet, as we look at Spartan culture today, the question remains, what do we admire in them, and what should we reject? What if the real lesson of Sparta isn't about honor and military discipline, but about the dangers of blind obedience, of a system that asks for everything and offers nothing in return? Sparta's glory was real, but so was their destruction, and it's a cautionary tale we can't afford to ignore. Their legacy lives on, not in the glory of battle, but in the costs they paid. So the next time we hear of military valor, of sacrifice for the state, we must ask ourselves, is this Sparta's victory or is it Sparta's warning? And can we afford to ignore the lessons they failed to learn? The Spartans died for discipline, but how much discipline is too much? Can we avoid the same fate, or are we destined to repeat the tragedy that was Sparta? Imagine standing in the shadows of Sparta's legacy, knowing that what made them great was also what brought them to the edge of destruction. The warriors who fought for honor, discipline, and glory were the same ones who sealed their own fate. The cost of their pride and sacrifice? A society on the brink of collapse. But here's the question you need to ask. Could we be walking the same path? How many of us are blindly following ideals without realizing the danger it carries? Do you dare to look deeper, to uncover the truths they didn't want you to know about Sparta? Hit subscribe now because we're diving deeper into the story of Sparta's tragic glory. And trust me, you won't want to miss where it leads. And comment below, do you think Spartan pride is what made them fall, or something darker? Let's uncover the truth together.